How the Jewish claim to Palestine is historically and religiously false. Chapter 6. The Israelites were given a second chance to redeem themselves during the first millennium BC, and that was in Palestine, with Jerusalem as their center of worship. Towards the end of the millennium, we see the events that lead to the second punishment mentioned in the Quran. By the 8th century BC, the northern areas of Palestine increased dramatically in their population. Israeli archaeologists Israel Finkelstein and Neil Silberman in The Bible Unearthed claim that compared to the 12th century BC, with its estimated population of 45,000, the increase was remarkable. Their estimate is 350,000 by the 8th century BC. It became the most densely populated area in the Levant. Does the Quran explain the sudden increase in population in Palestine after the first punishment? Well, it does. Then did we grant you the return as against them. We gave you increase in resources and sons, and made you the more numerous in manpower. If you did well for yourselves. If you did evil, you did it against yourselves. So when the second of the warnings came to pass, we permitted your enemies to disfigure your faces, and to enter your temple as they had entered it before, and to visit with destruction all that fell into their power. As we shall see, the second punishment was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70 by the zealotry of the Jews, the people of Judea. By all accounts, the rabbinic sages were expecting it, since they were forewarned. Between 1 and 3 centuries after the first punishment, throughout the Fertile Crescent we see nations rising again, and all had their roots in the lineages of the Beni Israel. Stephen Cole describes the rise of nations in Mesopotamia during the Iron Age after they were destroyed at the end of the Bronze Age. In the middle of the 8th century BC, Mesopotamia emerged from a dark age and entered a period of major development. Babylonian records give the impression that during the period between the 11th and 8th centuries BC, Mesopotamia also experienced a dark age. There was periodic famine and plague and recurrent brigandage and pillaging of towns by Aramaean tribes. The central government in Babylon was so weakened that its control was often restricted to the immediate vicinity of the capital. Urban economic activity was severely circumscribed, and there are suggestions of a general decline in urbanism and population levels as well. Mesopotamia, like Hittite lands to the west, experienced plagues and a severe decrease in population. In order to survive, the people might have become pastoralists, tending their flocks in any fertile areas they could find, possibly settling with other tribes with whom they had kinship ties. The city of Nippur had become surrounded by desert at the end of the second millennium BC, and its scattered population might have resorted to brigandage and tribal skirmishes. Between 1225 and 755 BC, the Euphrates had shifted its course to the west, away from the central alluvial plain. As a result, Nippur, Babylonia's ancient religious capital, was abandoned. By 755 BC, the Euphrates was once again flowing through the region, permitting large populations to once again move to Nippur and the surrounding lands. Nippur reached its largest size in 1400 years. Aramaean and Chaldean tribesmen had moved in by then and became dominant in the alluvial countryside surrounding Nippur. There were new golden opportunities for work and farming the lands. Aramaean tribes helped cultivate the land. Many brought their sheep to be sheared, taking advantage of the demand for wool needed for weaving. Women were once again employed on a large scale in the weaving industry. Trade flourished. Along several routes, iron tools were manufactured, and the population of the region expanded considerably. For the largely Aramaic-speaking world, life started looking up during the 8th century BC. Throughout the Fertile Crescent, we see nations rising again, and all had their roots in the lineages of the Beni Israel. The sudden population explosion, increase in resources and manpower was not something that only happened in Palestine. Aramaic replaced Akkadian as the lingua franca of the Near East. The Assyrian Empire declined in 1208 BC, along with all the nations of the second millennium BC. A brief return was attempted in the 11th century BC by Tiglath-Pileser I, but the area had experienced incursions of the semi-nomadic Aramaeans. The Assyrian kings began expanding their empire in the 9th century BC. A series of strong kings ruled during the 8th and 7th centuries BC. Tiglath-Pileser II, Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal all tried to rejuvenate the original conquests of Sargon I from the Euphrates to the Nile. The Assyrian kings were known for their cruelty and fighting skills. Coalitions of kings were formed to fight the Assyrians, but all resulted in defeat. The Chaldeans, Babylonians, Arameans, Elamites, and Arabs joined efforts to defeat the Assyrians. Here's an image, a relief of Assyrian king Ashurbanipal on a hunt, 668 to 627 BC. This is the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, 858-824 BC, King Jehu of the alleged biblical northern kingdom, who was subservient to the Assyrian king, kissing his feet. Sculptures of winged bulls with the king's face adorned royal palaces of Assyria. The Arameans were the most significant thorn in the side of the Assyrian kings. Their towns along the Tigris were seized, and hundreds of their people were transferred to Syrian towns. Tiglath-Pileser III, 744 to 727 BC, claimed he was able to bring them all under the control of the Assyrian Empire. Sargon II, 721 to 705 BC, boasted that he conquered Samaria in Palestine and defeated the house of Omri in northern Palestine. Palestine as a name was used several times in the archaeological record from the early part of the first millennium BC. But there is no evidence that the land was ever referred to as Israel. A basalt statue of an Egyptian named Padi-Eset, son of Api, possibly dated to the era of Sheshank I, 945 to 924 BC, was inscribed saying he was envoy of the Canaan and of Palestine. The word Palestine appears frequently on Assyrian records. An inscription on a stone slab found at Kala, attributed to Adad-nirari III, 810 to 783 BC, states that the king made an expedition to Palestine, referring to an area ruled by the Omrids in northern Palestine. An Assyrian inscription written during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, 744 to 727 BC, states the governor of Kasha campaigned against Palestine. The same king left an inscription on the Sab'a Stela, reporting that his Assyrian army marched against Palestine. An inscription by Sargon II, found on a prism at Assur, refers to his campaigns against Palestine and Judah as two separate entities. During the 8th century BC, Judea experienced an unusual increase in population. Prior to that, Judea's population is estimated by archaeologists to have been 1/10 of what it became in the 8th century BC. Palestine in general was hardly populated. Jerusalem was a poor village and did not show development until the 8th century BC, slowly progressing to the point when it became the spiritual center for the Bnei Israel. Towards the end of the 8th century BC, Jerusalem was expanded along its western hill. New suburbs were established and a defensive wall was constructed to include and protect these new areas. The city's population multiplied from an estimated 1,000 to 15,000 people. During the 8th century BC, Judah became a state with an administration ruled by an aristocracy, and there was an increase in wealth and introduction of new cultural practices. The sudden increase in wealth has perplexed many scholars who believe it must have been caused by Judah's ties to the economic growth of the Assyrian Empire. International trade must have expanded, leading to an economic revolution. Judah exported olive oil and wine to many parts of the Near East. During the 14th century BC, the Tel Amarna letters show Jerusalem's governor living a fairly modest life, governing people in small villages who earned their living farming and shepherding their flocks. Not until the 7th century BC onwards did Jerusalem become a prominent city in which the scribes would write the Torah and the texts that formed the Old Testament. Most scholars believe the book of Deuteronomy was written during the 7th century BC, with revisions taking place between the 7th and 5th centuries BC. King Josiah, 640 to 609 BC, who ruled Jerusalem at the time, claimed to find it in the temple, but it is evident that it was written during the 7th century BC, a period of expansion of literacy in Judah. Other forms of writing from that period, both Assyrian and Greek, closely match the writing style of the covenant between God and his people in Deuteronomy. Those were the days of the prophet Elijah, the Tishbite, who lived in Gilead and warned Ahab of problems to come. It was Elias who caused Ahab to gather the people to Mount Carmel, accusing them of having abandoned the God of the Bnei Israel and having worshipped pagan gods like Baal. It was Elias who instilled in them that they are the Bnei Israel, reminding them of the original 12 tribes and Allah's decree that Israel shall be thy name. calling out to Allah to prove through a miracle that he is more powerful than all their pagan gods, Ilyas cried out, "Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people may know that thou art the Lord God, and thou hast turned their hearts back again." Many of the people rejected their pagan gods and turned back to the God of the Beni Israel. Ahab's wife Jezebel rejected Ilyas and threatened him. She, along with many others, refused to obey. And when Ilyas died, the prophet Elisha from Gilgal took over the mantle of Ilyas that fell from him. Two of the most remembered prophets of the Beni Israel who preached in Palestine, Ilyas and Elisha, would remain in their minds forever, since it was they who renewed the covenant between Allah and his people. As the Quran says, thus indeed we reward those who do right. So also was Ilyas among those sent by us. Behold, he said to his people, will you not fear Allah? Will you call on Baal and forsake the best of creators? Allah, your Lord and cherisher, and the Lord and cherisher of your fathers of old? But they rejected him, and they will certainly be called up for punishment, except the sincere and devoted servants of Allah. And we left this blessing for him among generations in later times. Peace and salutation to such as Ilyas. The Bible tells us that vengeance was taken against the people who refused to obey the prophet Ilyas, and the orders were given by the prophet Elisha to destroy the house of Ahab because they shed the blood of prophets. Jehu gathered all the Baal worshippers and had them killed, cleaning the land from idol worship. Since the Bible is filled with distortions and inconsistencies, it is hard to know how many of these stories are true. The Assyrian records do mention many similar names in Palestine, but they don't always match the Bible's references or the timeline. The Quran mentions Elisha briefly in 2 surahs. One is, and commemorate Ismail, Elisha, and Dhul Kifl, possibly Ezekiel. Each of them was of the company of the good. The Assyrians had many campaigns in Palestine to keep law and order, and often did punish its rulers for acts that they considered punishable. The Assyrian king Sennacherib punished King Hezekiah, 715 to 687 BC, and many of his people, evicted them from Judah, imprisoned Hezekiah, and handed over his lands to other kings from Ashdod, Edron, and Gaza. Hezekiah's troops deserted him. In the bull inscription written by Sennacherib, he said he laid waste the large district of Judah and made the overbearing and proud Hezekiah, its king, bow in submission. The Nebi Yunus slab repeats the same story. Hezekiah was clearly not innocent in antagonizing Assyria. He often made alliances that would backfire against his people. During the period of Sennacherib, the prophet Isaiah told Hezekiah that Jerusalem would be saved for one reason only: the remnant that is expected of the house of Judah shall yet again take root downward and bear fruit upward. God told Hezekiah through Isaiah, I will defend this city to save it for mine own sake and for my servant David's sake. This is when we begin to hear about the remnant, a reference to the future days of the Quran's Messiah Isa, who would guide his people prior to the fall of the temple in 70. The remnant was a reference to events prior to and after the destruction of the temple in 70, which will be explained. It is during the reign of Hezekiah that we begin seeing the word Jew, or the Jews' language, mentioned in the Bible. It is also the first time we see it mentioned in the Sennacherib prism as Hezekiah the Jew. The Hebrew that emerged as the language of the Bible was a southern dialect of other Canaanite languages, a branch of the Northwest Semitic family of languages. It could be found in the region known as the Levant. The oldest example of Hebrew is the Khirbet Kiaf Ostrakon, dated to around 1000 BC. Biblical Hebrew is what was used in Judah in the second half of the first millennium BC. The later sections of the Bible show an Aramaic influence. The accuracy of the biblical stories becomes more evident as we get closer to the 7th century BC. The scribes who wrote the stories were naturally able to better recollect the more recent events in their history, beginning with the Omrid dynasty. When they tried to remember what happened prior to the 8th century BC, they made serious errors about the history of the Beni Israel that began nearly 2,000 years earlier in Mesopotamia, not Palestine. The stories of Hezekiah's struggles with the Assyrians and the attacks on cities like Lachish are confirmed by an Assyrian relief from Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh. Archaeological digs at Lachish also confirm the destruction. The Bible states that Hezekiah had built a pool and conduit, bringing water to the city of Jerusalem so they could withstand the long siege of Sennacherib. The Siloam inscription found at the entrance of Ezekiel's tunnel in Jerusalem confirms that his engineers worked hard to divert waters and create a reservoir within Jerusalem's walls. The scribes who wrote the Bible were not so much interested in documenting history as they were in stressing the wrath of God against their own people who shed innocent blood or who failed to shed their pagan beliefs, like Hezekiah's son Manasseh. Manasseh reinstated the pagan practices. They regarded attacks against them, like those of the Assyrians, as signs of God's punishment, and such beliefs were reinforced by their prophets. The prophet Isaiah had good reason to prophesy to Hezekiah that his friendly relations with Berodach-Baladan, son of the Babylonian king, would eventually backfire, as many of the people of Jerusalem would one day be taken into captivity to Babylon, once the Babylonians overthrew the Assyrians. What we gather from the archaeological evidence is that monotheism was a rare thing among the cultures of the Near East. It was not until the second chance to redeem themselves in the 8th century BC that it was regarded more seriously for perhaps the first time. Pagan practices permeated the religion of the Beni Israel, and we can find traces of them throughout the rituals of Second Temple Jews. The prophet Isaiah preaching during the 8th century BC, bemoaned the devastation of the Palestinian cities and countryside. Referring to the Beni Israel as similar to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, he condemned their rituals, sacrifices, and vain oblations. "To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices unto me, saith the Lord? I am full of the burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts, and I delight not in the blood of bullocks, or of lambs, or of he-goats." Hezekiah encouraged his subjects in Judah and the northern Palestinian areas to celebrate Passover together in Jerusalem. He said if the Beni Israel were to return to the God of Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Israel, their troubles with the Assyrians would end. He offered those of the northern areas, known as Ephraim and Manasseh, to join the people of Judah in abiding by the covenant. Many mocked his suggestions, while others joined in the Passover celebrations. When Manasseh became king, the people once again regressed to pagan practices. Manasseh, 698 to 642 BC, was obedient to the Assyrians. The Assyrian king Esarhaddon, 680 to 669 BC, mentioned in his Prism B. Manasseh and many of the kings of local city-states like Gaza, Ashkelon, Eran, Tyre, Edom, Moab, Byblos, Arvad, Samsim, Uruna, Beth-Ammon, and Ashdod all sent building materials to Esarhaddon for his palace in Nineveh. There were 22 kings of former Hittite lands did the same. The prophet Isaiah warned Hezekiah that life would continue this way until the period when God would establish a new and final covenant with the Beni Israel. Manasseh was simply giving in to the powers at the time, since it was considered to be the will of God. What was sinful about Manasseh's rule was his return to idolatry and his shedding of innocent blood, until he had filled Jerusalem from one end to the other. According to the Bible, the devout people of Palestine complained to the Assyrians that the various populations who were transferred by them to Palestine were ignorant regarding the manner of the God of the land. The Assyrian Empire was finally destroyed by a coalition of Chaldeans, Babylonians, and the Medes of northwestern Iran between 612 to 609 BC. The Assyrians remained pagan. Their primary god was Ashur. When Josiah reigned, reforms were made to return to the God of Ibrahim. 2 Kings states Josiah did that which was right in the sight of the Lord and walked in all the way of David his father and turned not aside to the right hand or to the left. During Josiah's 18th year in power, as laborers were repairing parts of the temple, Hilkiah, the high priest, is claimed to have discovered the book of the law in the house of the Lord. Most biblical scholars believe the sudden discovery was the work of several hands that began writing the 5 books that make up the Torah, or Pentateuch. The references to God in the Pentateuch as El, or Elohim, or Yahweh, are evidence of the different writers from the pagan world. The fact that some of the texts say Musa and the Beni Israel were at Mount Horeb, while others said it was Mount Sinai, shows the hands of different writers. Different sections of the Torah were written during different time periods, but the final effort of putting all the 5 alleged books of Moses together into one narrative is believed to have been done by the Babylonian scribe Ezra, Uzair, in the Quran. The Quran confirms that speculation. Then woe to those who write the book with their own hands and then say this is from Allah. To traffic with it for a miserable price, woe to them for what their hands do write, and for the gain they make thereby. The Quran continues, the Jews call Uzair a son of Allah. Allah's curse be on them. How they are deluded away from the truth. Uzair was held in very high esteem because of his bringing the Torah to Jerusalem. Some believed he received it through a revelation, since the original had been destroyed in the fire of the first temple in 587 BC. The fourth book of Ezra, dated to the 1st century CE, has Ezra like another Musa hearing God's words from a bush. When King Jehoiakim, 609 to 598 BC, son of King Josiah, came to power, he rebelled against the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, who seized Jerusalem and its treasures. Nebuchadnezzar also took some of its people captive to Babylon. But archaeologists claim that contrary to the exaggerated figures in the Bible, very few were transferred. The Bible claims that they would remain there until the words of the prophet Jeremiah were fulfilled, and until they all followed the Sabbath again. Some interpreters of the passage in Jeremiah believed they would remain captive until allowed to return by the Persian king Cyrus the Great to rebuild the temple half a century later. Archaeologists have shown minimal destruction to the temple, confirming that this was not the first time punishment against the Beni Israel mentioned in the Quran. The words of the prophet Jeremiah had nothing to do with the rebuilding of the temple. He was referring to events far in the future. Jeremiah said, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their father in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Mers, Egypt, which my covenant they broke, although I was a husband unto them, saith the Lord. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. Those days, God told them, will be when he will cause the branch of righteousness to grow up unto David, and he will execute judgment and righteousness in the land. The reference is to the final messenger of God, who would usher in the kingdom of God on earth, and would establish the final covenant that included both the Beni Israel and the Gentile world. At that time, God would establish a new Jerusalem, a different city than the one in Palestinian Jerusalem. The prophet Isaiah prophesied the same regarding the Beni Israel. He told King Hezekiah and his people who lived in Zion not to fear the Assyrians, for God shall smite thee with a rod, and shall lift up his staff against thee after the manner of Egypt. They were told it would only be for a short while, until the haughty leaders of Zion will be humbled. After that, God would send them a true king, a redeemer. Those words are the root of what we later see in the Gospels, when the Jews were expecting a final prophet referred to as the King of the Jews. And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. Jesse was the alleged father of biblical King David. The above passage with its mention of the branch is important when I later explain who the Nasara were in the Quran, a word that Muslims have mistakenly translated as and believed to be the Christians. The final messenger will be the final ruler of the lost sheep of Israel. He will have the Spirit of the Lord within him, will be filled with wisdom, knowledge, and will rule with justice. As will be seen when we get to the time period of the Messiah Isa, the reference is definitely to the Prophet Muhammad. As the prophets warned, it was the paganism of the Beni Israel, their warfare between one another, their bloodshed, political plots, the rejection and sometimes killing of their prophets that brought them such devastation. It was a national epic in which was embedded a moral lesson: break the covenants and you incur the wrath of Allah. Who influenced the writing of the Bible? Ancient Ugarit, Ras Shamra, on the Syrian coast, was one of the cities destroyed during the first punishment dealt against the Beni Israel. As mentioned before, they had a large archive of tablets that had been analyzed by scholars as the Ras Shamra parallels, published in 3 large volumes by the Catholic Church between 1972 to 1981. They are out of print, and they can be found in the Vatican Library, but I have my copies. Scholars who study the texts are in agreement that there are many similarities between Ugaritic literature and the biblical narratives. The wording and expressions are remarkably similar to those found in the Bible. The Ugaritic literature also gives names of Mesopotamian gods and beliefs and shows a connection to the Akkadian beliefs and traditions. The scholars who contributed to the studies in the 3 volumes all agree that Ugaritic Hebrew parallels prove that Hebrew and Ugaritic are related languages. As one of the scholars, S. Gewertz, states, in view of the impressive and ever-increasing body of evidence, the existence and continuity of a poetic tradition in Syria and Palestine of the 2nd and 1st millenniums, whatever may prove to be the linguistic position of Ugaritic, can no longer be open to doubt. There is also a clear connection between the Ugaritic people and the Akkadians and Cimmerians. Some of the words used in the text had Akkadian and Cimmerian words, just as we see in the Bible. Similarities exist between the Ugaritic letters and those of the Egyptian Telemarna letters. Jewish letters of the 2nd and 1st centuries BC also follow the same format, as well as those of Bar Kokhba, who rebelled against the Romans during the 2nd century. Between the 18th and 16th centuries BC, Ugarit was part of the Hurrian territory. During the 14th century BC, it formed part of the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni, and we know the Hurrians were related to the Israelites. The Bible and ancient texts state that the Hurrians were related to the Beni Israel, and archaeological evidence confirms it. The texts from which the religious beliefs of Ugarit were drawn were written in both Akkadian and Ugaritic. Ugaritic was a language closely related to Hebrew and Canaanite languages. Duane Smith, in his wisdom genre, demonstrates a connection between Ugaritic wisdom texts and the Hebrew Bible. He states, the sages of Ugarit and Israel worked within a common tradition. They used common structures and structural devices in their teaching. Mistakenly believing the biblical version of Israel as the northern kingdom being in Palestine, he further states, the structure of wisdom literature was fully evolved and available in its Babylonian dress in the Levant before the advent of Israel. Moral lessons imparted in Ugaritic literature can find their equivalents in biblical narratives. Biblical place names, expressions, prohibitions, terminology, names of gods, mythical characters all have their equivalents in Ugaritic literature. There is no doubt that the Ugaritic kingdom in Syria shared the same linguistic and cultural background as the Hebrews of Palestine. The oldest Ugaritic texts date to the late 15th century BC. Ugaritic beliefs included the story of the flood. They believed their holy temple in Syria, built on a hilltop surrounded by the city, held religious treasures from all over the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Arabia, and had been originally built by Sisyphes, their name for the prophet Noah. The Quran states that the flood was caused by Allah, who allowed the fountains of the earth to gush forth. The people of Ugarit believed that when the flood waters subsided, it was sucked into the ground at the location of their temple, which they covered with a large stone. The religious rituals of the people who made their pilgrimage to their temple strongly resemble the Jewish rituals found in Jerusalem during temple days. Scholars are in agreement that the Jews emerged from the Canaanite world. Ugaritic, Phoenician, Amorite, Aramaic, and Hebrew were all West Semitic languages. What set them apart in Palestine after the 8th century BC is the desire to shed pagan practices and become monotheistic. They were not the original Beni Israel, since their story began in Akkad and Sumer. The people of Judah came to be known as Jews. The Quran often differentiates between the Jews and the Israelites. The Assyrians, the Akkadians, and the Babylonians were East Semitic. Their languages differed. The Quran confirms that the Jews as a people and the Nasara, scholars of the Beni Israel, came much later in time after the period of Ibrahim, as the Quran states. Ibrahim was not a Jew, nor yet a Nasara, but he was true in faith and bowed his will to Allah's, and he joined not gods with Allah. Without doubt, among men, the nearest of kin to Ibrahim are those who follow him. To understand the history of Palestine during the first millennium BC, it's important to show that the entire Near East was filled with people who could trace their descent from or connection to the original Beni Israel. They were not just a people confined to Palestine, far from it. As mentioned earlier, the Babylonians, the Medes of ancient Persia, and the Chaldeans overthrew the Assyrian Empire. The Babylonians stepped into the shoes of the Assyrians and hoped to rejuvenate and control the empire of Sargon I. The Babylonians controlled Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine. The Medes controlled the remainder of the Assyrian Empire. The Medes ruled the lands between Anatolia and the Caspian Sea, as well as regions inhabited by the Elamites and Persians. According to the legends and the writings of the Mandaeans of Iraq, Nebuchadnezzar was a Babylonian Jew. When he raided and burned parts of Jerusalem's temple, 587 BC, capturing thousands of elites and transferring them to Babylon, it was the Jews and Israelites battling one another again. After Nebuchadnezzar's death in 562 BC, his empire weakened and Babylon fell in 538 BC, paving the way for the Persian Empire, established under Cyrus the Great. Cyrus established the Achaemenid Empire. Cyrus had under his power the Phoenicians, who inhabited coastal Syria, location of ancient Ugarit, down to Tyre in today's Lebanon. As long as he received tribute and loyalties of vassal states, he allowed them to rule themselves. Under Cyrus, many Jews were still hoping to re-establish themselves in Judea. In 537 BC, Cyrus permitted any exile who wished to do so to return to Judea. Some of them did, and Cyrus gave the orders for them to renovate the temple in Jerusalem, which archaeology has shown to have previously sustained minor damage. During this period, a small group of exiled scholars like Ezra, the Quran's Uzair, did return to re-establish themselves in Jerusalem. The competition between factions, the Samaritans versus the Judeans, commenced once again regarding the renovation of the temple, putting a hold on the effort. It was under the Persian king Darius that construction continued and was completed by 516 BC. Darius the Great, 522 to 486 BC, expanded the empire's control over the areas between the Black Sea and the Aegean during his rule. At its peak, the empire included the lands between Libya and today's Pakistan, south to the Gulf of Oman and north to the Aral Sea. Darius met with resistance from the Greek city-states once he dominated the Ionian cities, bringing Thrace under Persian hegemony. When King Xerxes rose to power, 486 to 465 BC, he was resented because of his repressive policies, particularly against Egypt and Babylon. In 480 BC, the Hellenic League prepared for the advances of the Persians under Xerxes. King Xerxes had attacked the Greek mainland, following which several wars broke out between Persia and Athens. By 479 BC, the Persians were defeated. Xerxes never again threatened Europe, and in 465 BC he was murdered by his own people. The kings who followed Xerxes left a trail of disaster until the Persian Empire finally fell. The gradual decay of the empire paved the way for the conquests of Alexander the Great. He was absolutely no doubt the figure mentioned in the Quran as Dhul Qarnayn in Surah Al-Kahf, known as the Two-Horned. Verily, we established his power on earth, and we gave him the ways and the means to all ends. The Jews and Israelites in Mesopotamia were convinced that he was the warrior foretold in the Bible's book of Daniel. For that reason, they joined him in his conquests, going as far as Afghanistan and the Indus Valley. The Gate of Gates that Alexander the Great built to hold back the Juj and Majuj, the Gog and Magog of the Bible, that the Quran tells us was between two steep mountainsides, was within the Hindu Kush mountains of Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires. The combined evidence in my research points to the Hindu Kush. Prior to Alexander the Great, there was very little evidence of the Persian presence in Palestine in the centuries preceding him. The Persian period was 538 to 332 BC. Archaeologists have found a very strong Greek presence, as well as a continued Egyptian influence. Under the influence of the Philistines, who arrived from the Aegean, as well as other people from the Hellenized world, a strong Greek influence could be felt in Palestine during the first millennium BC. The stories of the Greeks, from Alexander the Great onwards, will explain the events during the centuries that followed him that led to the breaching once again of the covenants between God and the Israelites and Jews. To understand the second punishment mentioned in the Quran, which was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, it is important to see what went wrong. Much of it had to do with the Jews themselves, who misunderstood and misinterpreted the prophecies of the prophets. It is their ignorance that brought the Israelite scholars and prophets from Mesopotamia to guide them prior to the fall of the temple. Those prophets and scholars were to guide the remnant that was mentioned by Isaiah, the ones who would survive the second punishment and guide their people to the truth. The Greeks had a great impact on the cultures of the Near East. According to Herodotus, during the Persian period, temples were erected to Zeus in both Babylon and Egypt, Thebes. Temples to Aphrodite were built by the Assyrians and Egyptians. The Phoenicians established a temple to Heracles in Tyre. In Palestine, the sites that would become centers of Christian worship during the 4th century had at one time been established as centers for the worship of Greek gods. Bethlehem was part of the territory where Adonis was worshipped. A temple erected to Venus became the Church of the Resurrection. The Temple of Jupiter in Damascus became the cathedral dedicated to John the Baptist. The poet Hesiod, at the end of the 8th century BC, who has been compared to Homer as having earned the respect of his countrymen, grew up in a centrally located village in Greece. Around 300 names of gods were given by Hesiod, some of whom were worshipped in the same manner as the Near Eastern people worshipped theirs. The end product was a Hellenized version of Near Eastern mythology. A long history of intellectual curiosity existed among the Greeks. They absorbed all the knowledge acquired in Mesopotamia and Egypt, including many of the laws, and that is evident in the writings of their politicians, poets, and philosophers. It is evident in their religious beliefs that show a resemblance to the many pagan beliefs of the Beni Israel throughout the Near East. Their god Zeus resided on top of Mount Olympus and had many of the attributes of the great bull of heaven that pagan cultures believed in. The Greek alphabet was derived from the Phoenicians around the 8th century BC, permitting Homeric, orally transmitted poetry to be put into writing. One of the greatest mathematicians, Pythagoras, 580 to 490 BC, was born to a Greek mother from Samos and a Phoenician father from Tyre. Pythagoras was born in Sidon and spoke Phoenician. Pythagoras believed the soul was immortal and the universe was controlled by spiritual powers. Thales of Miletus, 640 to 546 BC, influenced Pythagoras' ideas on the nature of the gods. The writings of many of the Greek philosophers show the influence of the Persians. Mesopotamia is where they learned astrology and religion. Thales developed ideas that would later challenge scientific learning, as he was influenced by Greek, Egyptian, and Babylonian sources. His knowledge of mathematics came from the Egyptians, and his understanding of astrology came from Babylon. In Phoenicia, Pythagoras was influenced by Jewish priests who taught him about the laws of Musa. He studied in Byblos and Tyre, visiting temples and absorbing their knowledge. The life of asceticism was common in the Levant, Phoenicia, and Palestine, even during the days of Pythagoras. Many ascetics secluded themselves in mountain caves where they would pursue spiritual meditation. The prophet Elias, biblical Elijah, was said to have spent time in the caves of Mount Carmel in Palestine, which is where Pythagoras spent time in seclusion. The Jews of Palestine attributed the practice of asceticism in Palestine to the period of the prophet Elias. Pythagoras spent 12 years in Babylon, where he was exposed to the beliefs of the Zoroastrians with their supreme god, who they named Ahura Mazda, the god of light, as well as the teachings in astronomy, science, and mathematics of the Magi. The Persian king Darius built the holy city of Persepolis in honor of Ahura Mazda. It was among the Persians that Pythagoras perfected his ability to foresee future events. In the lands of the prophet Yusuf, he learned the art of prophecy, which he believed could be scientifically derived. The students of Pythagoras spread to different parts of the Greek world, and some established their own schools. The astronomer Timaeus of Locri, 420 to 380 BC, founded his own school in Locri, Italy. His theories dwelt on the supreme God and his creation of the universe. The monasticism, ascetic lifestyle, the religious beliefs of various groups in Palestine during the Second Temple days had much to do with the continual flow of ideas of people who inhabited the Near East. It was perhaps through Alexander the Great, known in ancient Near Eastern texts as the Two-Horned, that the influence of Greek learning left its mark in the Near East. The stories of Alexander sweeping through Egypt, Palestine, Phoenicia, Syria, Babylonia, Persia, on eastward toward India and other parts of Asia captivated the imaginations of so many people. It was not only because he was such a successful conqueror, but it was because Jews and Israelites believed he was written in the book of Daniel and was therefore a fulfillment of prophecy. As he conquered undefeated throughout the Middle East, accompanied by the great sages of Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Persia, he brought unity in knowledge and thought between various cultures. Admired by so many people that he conquered, to the Israelites and Jews, he was a man of vision, who was guided by God. The historians Ptolemy, Aristobulus, and Aristotle's nephew Callisthenes, who accompanied him on his exploits, were certain that he was, since his successes were at great odds. The stories of his experiences would influence legends found in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim texts. Like Pythagoras before him, it was in Persia that Alexander learned of Ahura Mazda, the god of light, in whose honor the Persian king Darius built the holy city of Persepolis. Alexander, though, was hated by the Zoroastrians, who condemned his attack of Persepolis, the murder of its priesthood, and his destruction of their holy book, the Avesta. According to the Jewish Palestinian historian Flavius Josephus, the Jews believed the arrival of Alexander was a fulfillment of prophecy. The high priest Jaddua felt he was forewarned in a dream that the Jews should not fear Alexander, but should make appropriate preparations for his arrival in Jerusalem. The Jews did everything they were warned to do in their high priest's dream, but the reaction to them by Alexander seemed amazing to the Syrians, Phoenicians, and Chaldeans who witnessed it. Alexander approached the high priest and showed adoration for the name of God engraved on the mitre. According to Flavius Josephus, when Alexander was asked privately why he showed such adoration, his response said he was not adoring the high priest, but the God who honored him with his high priesthood. For I saw this very person in a dream in this very habit when I was at Dios in Macedonia, who, when I was considering with myself how I might obtain the dominion of Asia, exhorted me to make no delay and boldly to pass over the sea thither, for that he would conduct my army and would give me the dominion of the Persians. According to Flavius Josephus, Alexander offered sacrifices to God in the Jerusalem temple, and when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that he was the person intended. And when Alexander asked the high priest what favor he could grant him, he requested that they might enjoy the laws of their forefathers and might pay no tribute in the 7th years. He granted all they desired, and when they entreated him that he would permit the Jews in Babylon and Media to enjoy their own laws, also, he willingly promised to do hereafter what they desired. And when he said to the multitude, if any of them would enlist themselves in his army, on this condition that they should continue under the laws of their forefathers and live according to them, he was willing to take them with him, and many were ready to accompany him in his wars. Arrian and Plutarch, Alexander's historians, drew an image of a man who was quite taken in by Persia. Alexander spent a good length of time in Susa, which he named Seleucia on the Eulias, and even encouraged intermarriage of his Macedonian soldiers with Persian women. Historians claim that 10,000 such marriages took place. A large number of Alexander's companions married Persians, and thereby accepted their new home. Among these were Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Hephaestion. Alexander married into Persian royalty and took Persian princesses, Barsine, Parysatis, as wives, and his Persian wife Roxanne became the mother of his only son and heir, Alexander IV. Alexander was much loved by his soldiers, who regarded him as a benevolent commander of his troops. There was a constant feeling among most of them that he was guided and protected by the gods. As Alexander's army traveled with him, many brought with them their wives and children. Alexander had a thirst for knowledge, and having traveled as far as India, he exchanged ideas with Indian philosophers. As proof, Greek and Egyptian artifacts have been excavated by archaeologists as far as India. The rulers of Kandahar, particularly the Buddhist Asoka, were educated in Greek philosophy, and the ideas from the Buddhist monasteries traveled between India and Syria. Alexander had lived in Babylon within the palace of Nebuchadnezzar and spent time in Nisibis, modern Nusaybin, close to today's Syrian-Turkish border. It was there that the great rabbinic school was established in later years for the preservation and study of the Babylonian Talmud. Jewish scholars believed the academy was probably in existence during the 1st century BC, and there is some evidence that Judah ben Bethira established his academy in Nisibis before the fall of the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70. Nisibis had long been a center of scholarship and continued to be so during the Christian era. Nusaybin, as you see at the top of the map on the border, it's along the Syrian-Turkish border, was Nisibis. Alexander encountered the sophists in India. They were expert in prophecy, but only prophesied about the weather and any public calamity. Alexander found them harmless and useful, as they were skilled in medicinal arts, curing diseases, snake bites, and injuries. Alexander was very interested in the art of healing with herbs and various plant roots. In Macedonia, it was the methods of Persia, Egypt, and India that were used by doctors. The Indian sophist Phoenis was a close friend of Alexander, joining him on his journey back to Susa in western Iran. Anaxarchus, the sophist, stated that justice sits by the throne of Zeus. It has been speculated by some scholars who have studied the artwork of Muslim Asia as well as the beliefs of Muslim Sufis that the sophists of Alexander's era later emerged as Islam's Sufis. Alexander's historian Arrian described him as having shrewdness of judgment. He showed great care for religion and had the most wonderful power to discern the right course when it was still unclear. Alexander founded cities throughout the empire, so the Persian tribes like Euxians, Mardians, Kosaeans, neighbors of the Susians, and Medes were all pacified. The cities were built so that the nomads would become cultivators and tillers of the ground and have a stake in the country, might be deterred from injuring one another. Alexander was known to keep his treaties, agreements, and promises. He protected himself from fraudulent acts, spent money sparingly on himself, but was most generous with others. While the impression given by historical literature is that Alexander worshipped many gods, the Ethiopic, Syriac, and Hebrew texts claim Alexander was God-fearing. The earliest historians who wrote about Alexander gave the impression that he was divinely guided during many of his conquests. As Arrian states, "I do not believe that a man peerless among mankind would have been born without divine agency. Signs of this are said to have been given by oracles on Alexander's death." The Ethiopic texts claim that Alexander was accompanied on his journeys by many sages. One of these was Matun from Babylonia, a God-fearing man who instructed Alexander on the stories of the Well of Life. Another was the scribe Rahman, who was with Alexander in Babylon when he died, and among his last words, Alexander is said to have told Rahman that the righteous are those who have forsaken and rejected the begetting of children and earthly possessions. Whether or not the story is true, what it reveals is a perception by some that Alexander promoted celibacy or the company of men in a simple life. The Greek historians confirm it in their descriptions of Alexander and his closeness to his male companions. According to Arrian, a eunuch in the palace of Darius said Alexander is the noblest and most self-controlled of men. Over bodily pleasures, he exercised the greatest self-control. The rituals that Alexander performed, the frequent bathing before prayers, the communal meals with his men, became very typical of the monastic communities that dotted the Near East in later years. The philosophies of Pythagoras and Epicurus also promoted extreme self-control over one's impulses, and Epicurus himself discouraged marriage and having children. It should not be surprising that in a Hellenized world, influenced by such great masters, some of the people of the Near East would develop a belief that monasticism was acceptable. That belief would be apparent a few centuries later in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There should also be no doubt that the Quran Surah Al-Kahf concerning Dhul Qarnayn was about Alexander the Great. As the Bani Israel were listening to the revelations of the Quran, it confirmed that this was a reference to Alexander. The Quran says, "Verily, we established his power on earth, and we gave him the ways and the means to all ends. One such way he followed, until when he reached the setting of the sun, he found it set in a spring of murky water. Near it he found a people. We said, O Dhul Qarnayn, you have authority either to punish them or to treat them with kindness. He said, whoever does wrong, him shall be punished. Then shall he be sent back to his Lord, and he will punish him with a punishment unheard of. But whoever believes and works righteousness, he shall have a goodly reward, and easy will be his task as we order it by our command. The Persian miniatures from the Khamsa of Nizami. It shows Alexander the Great, dressed in green Persian attire, examining his portrait. The Persian miniature shows Alexander the Great building the Iron Gate of Gates between the steep mountains. As I will later explain, this was within the Khyber Pass between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Alexander's generals, Hephaestion and Perdiccas, were believed to be here with Alexander. Once Alexander returned from his conquest, he began uniting the Greek and Persian cultures. His empire was vast, and by the early part of the 3rd century BC, it had fragmented into pockets of Greek influence. 3 predominant kingdoms existed: the descendants of Ptolemy I in Egypt, of Antigonus in Macedonia, and the Seleucids who ruled between Asia Minor and areas beyond Persia. Alexander's influence was felt throughout these regions, where he united the Greek and Asian cultures that came to be known as Hellenism. The Ptolemies replaced the pharaohs and brought a Greek influence to Egypt, as well as a large influx of Greek immigrants. Egypt became a center of scholarship and learning, encouraging scientific and mathematical research. Alexandria's library boasted 700,000 manuscripts, preserving centuries of Greek literature and knowledge. Understanding the Greek influence in Palestine and the Near East is important to understand the events that transpired during the period before the arrival of the Messiah Isa. Many of the described habits and lifestyle of Alexander would later appear in Palestine, practiced by the Jewish sect, the Essenes. Alexander admired the Persian system of ruling a diverse population. Babylonia had a mixed population which included Persians, Arabs, Jews, Indians, and Macedonians. Even under the Persian kings, Jews who lived in Babylonia served in the royal palace and were warriors or mercenaries in the king's army. On the palace walls of Susa were carvings of archers from the king's private guard. The Persians who believed in Ahura Mazda, the god of light, were also believers in a sovereign, supreme being, creator of heaven and hell, light and darkness. Much of the terminology that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls had its roots in Persia. The Jews of Palestine were very much a part of the varied cultures of the Near East. Alexander had expanded the channels of communication between various areas of the empire. Large networks of roads improved the movement of goods, leading to economic enhancements. Alexander created new centers for international trade. As goods were exchanged, so were ideas. The Greeks adopted the love of learning from the cultures of the Near East. The quest for knowledge continued for centuries, with Persia remaining one of its primary centers. In the vicinity of today's Ahvaz in the Persian province of Khuzestan, an academy of learning once existed named Kudeshapur. Its fame was known throughout the Middle East and as far as Central Asia. The scholars who taught there were Greeks, who exposed their students to the classical literature of both the Greek and Roman worlds. The academy survived through the Abbasid period after the rise of Islam. It was here that Muslim scholars picked up the pieces and translated Old Greek texts into Arabic, preserving them for future generations. According to Iranians, the location of that academy is today's Gotwand. Western Iran, Susa and Ahvaz. It was in this area the academy was. With the arrival of the Greeks, it was the Jews of Palestine who began revolting against their rule, even though history shows that the Greeks were settling in Palestine from the time of the Philistines and were certainly part of the fabric of the Palestinian landscape. Palestine was not a land of one ethnicity, and one could argue that the group of Canaanites who emerged as Jews was just one group of people who lived in Judea. The language of the original Israelites was certainly not the Hebrew spoken by the Jews of Palestine. The Bible composed by the Jewish scribes in Jerusalem was an attempt by the Jews to lay claim to the entire history of the Israelites, as though they were the only remaining Israelites. They falsely placed the story of the Israelites in Palestine taking their history out of the correct chronology and location in order to conform to their own agendas. Little did they know that one day archaeologists would prove them to be wrong. As we continue with the story of the Greeks, we can see how the stage was set for the second punishment that the Israelites were warned about. By 200 BC, the three remnants of Alexander's empire struggled to survive. While Macedonia stagnated, the Seleucids encountered problems with their ethnically diverse territories. At the beginning of the 2nd century BC, Antiochus III had managed to take over Palestine from the control of King Ptolemy V. 30 years later, it was under Antiochus VI that Jerusalem found itself immersed in Hellenistic culture. The reforms he introduced set off the Jewish rebellions that continued under the Roman Empire. In a Hellenistic world, it is easy to imagine that a savior came to the Bene Israel who was considered divine. Greek mythology was filled with stories of gods having children. This was not, however, anything that the Bene Israel believed in or were expecting. It was a complete distortion of their religious beliefs. Many Jews and Samaritans lived in Alexandria, Egypt, during the reign of Ptolemy I. The synagogue of Alexandria, built around 225 BC, offered services in Greek, which replaced Aramaic as the language of choice. Greek culture began to influence the Jewish way of life, and many in the religious hierarchy resented it. Jewish and Greek cultures influenced one another, but it became apparent that a sense of disapproval developed among the Greeks, that Jews had this distinct hatred for non-Jews. Anti-Jewish literature began to surface. Shortly thereafter, Alexandrian Jews made available to the Greeks translated copies of the Old Testament known as the Septuagint. Besides these, other writings were translated that became known as the Apocrypha, written in Greek and originally translated from lost texts. For the first time, Greeks and other pagans had full access to the literature of the Jews. In Palestine, Jews were divided between those who were willing to accept some elements of Greek influence on their customs and those who wanted nothing to do with them, like Joshua ben Sira. The friction came to a peak when under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, 175 to 163 BC, a Greek-style gymnasium was constructed in Jerusalem. The Orthodox Jews condemned nakedness, and some Greeks disapproved of circumcision. Another source of discontent also took place when Jerusalem's walls were torn down and the treasury was confiscated. The observance of the Sabbath and rituals of circumcision were forbidden, and Antiochus placed a statue of the Greek god Zeus inside the Holy of Holies within the temple. The Samaritans had their own temple located on Mount Gerizim near today's Nablus, which competed with the Jerusalem temple. Even this was required to have the statue of Zeus in it. The religious zealotry that followed led to the Maccabean revolt, organized by the Hasmoneans. Eventually, the zealotry led to a civil war between Jews because the Hasmoneans took over the high priesthood, although they did not descend from the required priestly Aaronite lineage. Book of 1 Maccabees gives a history of this period until 135 BC. The nationalistic and religious fervor of the time met with some success in minimizing the Hellenistic influence on Judaism. There was constant friction between the Jews and Samaritans who disapproved of the Hasmonean revolt, causing the Hasmonean ruler John Hyrcanus I to destroy Samaria, their capital, and its temple on Mount Gerizim in Shechem. Nablus was later built nearby by the Romans. Hyrcanus made circumcision mandatory after forcing the Samaritans to convert to Judaism. There was also resentment from the Idumeans and the Galileans who were forced to convert to Judaism. Typically, however, the general Jewish public never recognized the Samaritans as real Jews. Genetic studies have shown that the Samaritans and the Jews were related people, as are today's Palestinians. The differences are in their beliefs, their cultural practices, which led the Jews to claim that the Samaritans were not real Jews. The Samaritans were considered to be two-faced, and when the Jews suffered setbacks, they denied being Jews. And when good fortune descended on the Jews, Samaritans would claim they were related to them through the lineage of Yusuf. There are many incidents that occurred between the two communities since the time of the Maccabees, when Hyrcanus, 134 to 104 BC, was chosen as high priest. As all this was taking place, a new empire, the Romans, approached from the west, hoping to replace the power of the Greeks. With the arrival of the Romans, agreements were signed with the Jews, permitting them freedom of worship throughout the lands under Roman control. Jewish customs were nonetheless disliked in Rome, and Judaism developed a reputation for believing in demons, angels, and magic. The Romans went from republic to empire, and this was made plain under Augustus in 27 BC. One of his first acts was to pacify the lands that came under Roman control and to improve the way they were administered. In the Near East, Augustus annexed Egypt. By the time he died in 14, he had consolidated a powerful empire that would last for centuries. Much anti-Jewish literature was written at this time in Egypt under the Ptolemies. The Palestinian Jewish historian Flavius Josephus claimed that they regarded Jews as barbarians who were incapable of the intellectual achievements of Hellenistic cultures. Greeks complained that Jews segregated themselves from Gentiles, pursued careers as merchants and moneylenders, and followed too many restrictive laws as prescribed by their faith. The laws found in the Jewish Bible are different from the ones the Israelites were given by their prophet Musa. The Quran says the law was given to the prophets who submitted to the will of Allah, Aslamu, meaning they were Muslims. Those who became Jews, Hadua, would be judged by those laws. They were given laws of equal measure, life for life, eye for eye, nose for nose, ear for ear, tooth for tooth, and wounds equal for equal. But if anyone remits the retaliation by way of charity, it is an act of atonement for himself. The scripture that was given through the Prophet Muhammad is the same scripture that was given to prior prophets. It was the Jews who altered it to differentiate themselves from others. When the Injil, or original gospel, was given to the followers of the Messiah Isa, it was the Jews who distorted it once again, as we shall see. They pitted themselves against the Israelites who came from Mesopotamia, who had a better understanding of what the original laws were. After all, the majority of the prophets lived and died in Mesopotamia, not in Palestine. Jews defended themselves as creators of abundant religious literature, which they translated into Aramaic and Greek. However, the antagonistic relationship between Jews and Greeks remained, and Egyptians resented them even more. Jews had established good relations with the Romans in Egypt, while the Greeks were tired of Roman rule and some were experiencing a nationalistic awakening. Jews were aspiring for equal privileges that the Greeks enjoyed. The Greeks in Alexandria were not required to pay the poll tax, and they were given the right of citizenship. The Jews wanted the same rights. However, under the government of Aulus Aemilius Flaccus, 32 to 33, the situation worsened. Flaccus felt threatened by prominent members of the Greek community, and to pacify them, carried on anti-Jewish policies. Later, while Agrippa, in the year 38, was in power in Palestine, Flaccus continued his policy, leading to riots within the community and many fatalities among the Jews. Events were so serious that many Jews fled Alexandria, where they were a minority, settling in other parts of Egypt. There they endured serious poverty because of the loss of their properties. It was into this atmosphere that the Messiah Isa arrived in Palestine, as a warning to his people regarding the impending second punishment mentioned in the Quran. Every prophet brought a warning and good tidings regarding the future of his people if they heed the warnings. Next is chapter 7, explaining who the Messiah Isa was, giving evidence of what happened when he arrived in Syria and Palestine.